Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's Close of Business Tuesday, and we've got a fantastic segment for you. I know we say that a lot, but we always mean it. And today it's totally true. We've got Congresswoman Lizzie Fletcher with us, so we can't wait to talk to her about what's going on in Washington, D.C. We've got a range of questions that we're going to kick around with her. Bobby Tudor is also going to join, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the things he's been doing in the Greater Houston Partnership, but he knows Lizzie, so we thought it'd be great to have them both. But before we get to our feature attraction, Mike Bradley, what's going on the screen today?
Yeah, I don't know. The screen's a little bit mixed today, Maynard, but, kind of give you a wrap-up of what's happened in the last week since we talked on the previous Tuesday, close of business. What we've seen is WTI has rallied up here, up about 2.5% up to $75. Time spreads are pretty strong. Obviously, we had to break down in the OPEC meeting last week. And that initially pushed crude down, but we're kind of coming right back towards highs. Natural gas is up 1.5%, got up to almost $3.75. And the interesting thing about that is I think a lot of people have anticipated it's gone a lot further than people thought, and I think people are waiting for a pullback here. The other thing I'd say is, with the OPEC meeting kind of breaking down, is we've seen the damage that's being done to the energy equities. The energy equities don't like the uncertainty, and so we've seen the E&Ps and service have underperformed here over the last week. The only thing I'd like to say probably is, before we meet next time, when we do meet next time, what we're going to be talking about is oil service earnings. They start in next Tuesday, with the big three is going to start reporting. And I think it's going to be looked at. A lot of people are going to be focused on it because they're going to want to hear what, these service companies are hearing from their upstream clients. And I think what they're going to be hearing is not much. I think you're going to see CapEx guidance is going to be pretty straightforward for these E&P companies. They're not going to be picking up cap spending until probably next year at the earliest. And so I think you're going to listen to these oil service companies. Try to shy away from talking about that and really talk about what they're going to be doing with free cash flow, what they're going to be doing with these energy service subs that they have, specifically 2 or 3 of these guys. So I think it's going to be a pretty slow week this week, but it's going to start to kick off next week with Q2 service earnings. So we're pretty excited about that.
Okay, awesome. You're right. There's definitely a lot exciting about to kick off. Matt Portillo, what's on your mind? I know you had the huge carbon sequestration conference today, so maybe I'll tease out of you a couple tidbits there, but what else you got?
Yeah, Maynard, I think that's the key focus of my conversation today. We just wrapped up about 5 minutes ago the conference. It started out at 8 a.m. this morning and went for the whole day. One of the best attended conferences we had in a long time, 725 or so investors and industry personnel that attended. And we had presentations really covering the gamut of a bunch of different topics. We started out in the morning really talking about some of the advantages that both Canada and the U.S. have from a pore space perspective. It looks like for carbon sequestration, this is going to be the hot spot when it comes to that pore space and the ability to actually sequester carbon moving forward. Talked to quite a few participants that are building out infrastructure on both sides of the border, and those projects are moving along nicely. And then we spent some time around the policy, and policy is still going to be a big focus. I know we've talked about this a lot on the segments that we've done here and some of the participants we've had on CUBT. The current policies in place from a credit perspective are good enough to get the low-cost projects off the ground, but we do think we're going to need to see additional incentives on the policy side, both in the U.S. and Canada, to really cause a boom in investment to where the oil and gas industry will be incentivized to build out that infrastructure and to put the equipment in place to really participate in removing carbon from the system and permanently sequestering it. On the technology side, there were some great presentations on technology that's working to address capturing carbon off of gas plants, which I think is going to be a really interesting conversation for gas producers moving forward, producing zero carbon emission gas and the potential ramifications of long-term consumption over the medium term. And then we also had various different technology companies speaking about utilization of carbon away from sequestration. So overall, it was a great conference. We'll have a replay out in the not too distant future. And if you missed it, feel free to reach out to your TPH representative, which in many cases is Maynard, as he always likes to highlight. and we'll get that replay out to you. But if you have any additional questions, also the research team will be available. And obviously the banking team is very in the weeds on this topic as well.
Well, fantastic, Matt. And yes, I do enjoy being everyone's representative, so let it rip. One question, Matt, how many people did we have at the attending today?
So we had about 725 registrants, and people obviously ebb and flow depending on the various different topics. But at the peak of the conference, it looked like we had about 550 or so participants. And quite frankly, relative to some of the other conferences we've had, the amount of questions coming in for various different investors and industry participants was off the charts. So the engagement was exceedingly high. And as we've talked about over the last few months, it feels like we're at the nascence of really investment in this technology moving forward. And it could be a really interesting solution for reducing carbon emissions on a global perspective, and will probably need to be part of the solution over the medium to long term.
It's fantastic, Matt. Congrats to you and your team, and to all our friends who could attend. It was really so great to have you. Colin Fenton, what is on your mind now? True confession, Colin and I had breakfast in a Boston diner this morning. So we are fresh from talking about the real world in a diner. We're going to try to have more diner visits in our future. But Colin, what else you got going?
Well, first on that point, I can confirm that the owner of the establishment was explaining the coffee maker to you and some of the coils and some of the technology. So it was commodities all around. This week we've gotten more of a drumbeat on the inflation theme. And at this point, it's just kind of becoming noise. There's just so much data that shows us inflation is here. It would be easy to overlook some of the core points that came out of the US CPI report for June. And I appreciate it's a little bit dry, but bear with me for a minute because I do think it's important. The core inflation number for June came in at 0.9% month on month. That was expected to be 0.6 by consensus. Now, core, you might think, is like 30 or 40% of the total. It has kind of this sense of being small and nuclear at kind of the heart of the entire report. It's actually 80% of the total. I don't think a lot of people may be aware of that. Also, the 5.4% headline year over year, of course, picks up base effects. And that really is not the right way to look at this statistic. But in the past 3 months, the core inflation number is up at an 8% annualized rate. And you cannot persuade us that there was anybody coming into 2021 that had that as their base case. Even the pro-inflation view people are seeing numbers that are beating kind of their best estimates. Food is 14% of the total. It was also up 0.9% month on month. Energy is 6% of the total. It was up 1.5% month on month. Now, with WTI breaching resistance at 75, natural gas also punching higher all around the world, we may see that 1.5 number begin to slow down, but for sure, it really is really strong at this moment. Now, there's been a lot of focus on the half dozen segments propelling the headline CPI number. Used cars, most notably, hotel rates, airfares, food away from home. So you get this transitory story that obviously those things are about coming out of the pandemic, and they are by definition transitory. But let's be clear, restaurants were up 0.7% month on month for the strongest monthly gain since 1981. And to be clear, in restaurants, there are no used cars on the menu. So we clearly have something happening here in very important parts of the non-core part of the economy, where it does look like even some wage inflation is now spilling into prices paid and prices received. And just because there are obviously transitory components to what is happening, that does not mean that there isn't simultaneously a durable shift into an inflation regime. In fact, both are happening, and even a third. We've got the idiosyncratic disruptions for one, cost push from underinvestment in supply is two. Think of where we are in the land of energy and commodities. And then three, of course, the fiscal and monetary debasement. And we haven't even gotten to a fourth kind of inflation, which is when the demand side presses against supply capacity limits. And then one last thing on the inflation side, and then I just want to show one chart. We've seen a lot of interest in the potential for a $100 crude oil price. Last month on this program, we pointed out the burgeoning open interest in $100 calls. we're seeing a rash of articles predicting $100 crude today and what that high price might mean for the economy. But let me do a little bit of a parlor trick before your eyes. $100 per barrel is the equivalent of $2.38 per gallon. They are literally equivalent. So think about that for a minute. What your opinion is of 238, that's what your opinion is of $100 per barrel, just different units. Our bet is you may very well find that we're back to people realizing that $100 oil is not exactly the highest price, and it wasn't even back in 2010 or 2008 or in prior monetary regimes. And then I finally just want to make one last point about what's been happening since mid-June as all of this inflation data has been coming out. It was interesting that on June 7th, the Fed pivoted to change its tune, recognizing that these inflationary numbers were besting its expectations, that instead of having the 2 to 3% year-over-year numbers, we were now getting 4, 5, and of course, with the June number even higher. And so there is this idea of the rate hikes that we all know are somewhere out there are now possibly going to happen in 2022, maybe even 2021, as we've surmised in the past. That would have presumably some effect on this scorching growth. The chart I want to show is what actually happened in June with PMIs. Here you can see global economic activity by month for a number of developed and developing countries. And what really stands out is we have the COVID slowdown, the recovery, and then here in June of 21, some notable slips from India, Russia, Mexico, Malaysia, Singapore, Egypt, and Vietnam. In many cases, this was COVID related, but there has definitely been a little bit of a slowdown, a little bit of a pause here in economic activity as we get to the middle part of the year. And so we have $75 oil prices, even with that happening in the emerging markets, teeing up potentially a call again on OPEC to bring us some more supply.
That's great, Colin. Well, I think we're going to jump to Lizzie. I think the thing about inflation that's so interesting is we've changed our attitude. We've decided to tolerate a little bit more. And we used to think that you can't let something like that grow because it could get away from you. But now somehow we sort of act like, don't worry, the tiger won't bite you, kind of philosophy, which worries me. Well, huge round of applause for Lizzie Fletcher. Lizzie, we're so excited to have you. For those of you who don't know Lizzie, she represents the 7th Congressional District right here in Houston, Texas. She also, I find it really fascinating, this was the district that George H.W. Bush also represented at one time. She was recently reelected, so I think you're in your second term, Lizzie. And I don't know if you're a native Houstonian, but I know you grew up in Houston, and so you certainly know all of us well. But let me just stop by saying it's a real honor to have you. Really excited to talk about what's happening in Washington, the energy issues. I don't know that there's ever been a more exciting time to be around the energy and other policy discussions that are happening. So let me stop talking. Lizzie, welcome. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much, Maynard. It's great to be with you. I'm really glad to be here.
So Lizzie, maybe one place to start is, when you think about the policy issues in the country right now, and if you were just, kind of thinking like getting out your yellow pad and saying, okay, what are our big problems? What are our focus issues? What can we get done? What are your focus issues? Like, how do you see the problems? What kind of rank order do you have to them? Like, how are you thinking about your biggest priorities?
Well, thanks. Yeah, it's a great question. And, I organize my priorities and my focus based on the priorities of my district. And as you noted, I represent the 7th Congressional District here in Houston, Texas, the energy capital of the world. So energy policy is always on my mind. There's a lot going on that in Congress, which I'm sure we'll talk about. So that is a top priority. And one of the reasons I asked to serve and was appointed to the Energy and Commerce Committee in the Congress in my second term. You're right about that. So now serving on energy and commerce, and that also drives a lot of what I do. Another thing that we do here in Houston is we are leaders in healthcare, and we have incredible innovation and incredible quality of care here in my district and in Houston. And I serve on the health subcommittee of energy and commerce. So that's also a big part of my work, and it's a huge priority for our district because despite the incredible innovation and quality care here, we also have the highest rate of uninsured residents in the country. So, from the many lessons we've learned during the last year of this pandemic, we know that ensuring our neighbors have access to affordable health care is really vital to the health of our communities and of our country. So that is also a top priority. And of course, here on the west side of Houston, infrastructure investment has also been a priority. It's a priority of this Congress and of the president, who laid out his vision in the American Jobs Plan, building on a lot of the work that we did in the House and the last Congress. And there I served on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee in that Congress. So I helped lay out that framework and can have continued to work on those issues, even though I've moved on to the Energy and Commerce Committee in this Congress. And I'm really focused on making sure that our needs here in the Houston region are addressed in the infrastructure package. And there's so many things. I mean, like you said, there's so much going on in our country. So there are a lot of other priorities. And probably on this Tuesday in particular, I think it's important to note that working to preserve, protect, and defend our democracy, our right to vote, and our democratic institutions is a focus for me and really must be a focus for all of us. But like you said, there's so much happening in the Congress that I'm really privileged and excited to work on all kinds of issues that really are of great importance here in the Houston community and across the country.
So, Lizzie, that was a great kickoff. One thing I guess I'm struck by as you were talking about, it's one of our other questions is kind of what are you hearing from the district? Are you are energy companies doing a good job communicating with you, trying to tell you how they see the issues, how they see the time frame, how they see the pressures? What's been your experience? Grade us, because all of us are in energy. We want to educate people and share our thoughts, but how good is the industry doing sharing its thoughts with you about its views?
Well, I would say in terms of sharing thoughts with me, the industry is doing a very good job. We are very engaged with so many people who live and work in the 7th Congressional District in Texas. And so there are so many people here who are in various segments of the industry. And I work very hard to stay connected. I was just doing a town hall earlier today at a company here in Houston, talking to employees, talking about energy policy, talking about a lot of the issues that are in front of us. And I think that it has been a priority for me to engage on all of those issues. And so I feel like we're having great dialogue, both with folks in the industry, as well as I've had conversations with Bobby and the Greater Houston Partnership about how we here in Houston address the energy transition and how we look forward and really how we have a leading role in these issues that are before the Congress and facing the country. I think more broadly, there are a lot of opportunities for folks in industry to engage more and really to demonstrate what I truly believe is the commitment here in Houston that we see to addressing the dual challenge, right? To meeting global energy demand, not just domestic, but global energy demand, while also addressing climate change and reducing emissions. And I think that those are real priorities that while I'm hearing from folks, I think it's great to engage with more members of Congress and folks across the Hill to make sure that that partnership and that interest is clear. I guess one of the ways I would describe it, and maybe I'll sort of summarize with this, I see a huge part of my job as making sure that the perspective that my constituents here in Houston have on the many, many issues that are part of this discussion are really driving the conversation, right? To develop objectives and goals and meet them that are ambitious but also achievable, and really to do that in a way that brings people together, stakeholders of all kinds. And develop a consensus plan about our path forward. And if I could give one piece of advice, if I could ask for one thing, I think the most productive thing we can do is really depoliticize the conversation about our energy future. I really think that that is essential to moving forward in a way that helps us meet our goals, both in terms of energy production and tackling the climate crisis.
That is such a great comment, Lizzie. We put a little subject line when we send out close of business. I think it should be, let's depoliticize before we decarbonize.
Well, let's do both.
Well, it seems like such a big part of the problem is, I mean, we do this every week. So I'd be curious. And of course, we do it as a living. And energy and climate and development and all these issues are wildly complicated, right? And so how someone in your district that doesn't do this all the time, or people in Congress try to understand these issues, and then on top of that, you layer in this politicization of everything, and it just gets so hard. It just seems like people have not. Is it better, Lizzie, when you're hanging out and the cameras are off than it seems to be if you're just watching one of the highly opinionated news services that we're usually tuning into?
Yes. I mean, I would definitely say that there is a lot of constructive work that goes on in the Congress, and there's a lot of bipartisan work that goes on in the Congress. This Congress, I would say, has been a little bit more challenging than the last Congress. We've dealt with some really important issues, and clearly there's a lot still to be resolved. And, you know, I remain optimistic and hopeful that we can and that we will address and really come together to kind of deal with that. I think you have to do that in this job. I think if you can't feel like the work that you do is going to make a difference, has the potential to make a difference, then, you know, maybe it's not time to be doing it. I think you have to maintain that optimism. And like I said, there's a lot of work. I don't have the statistics right in front of me right now, but there's a lot of work we've done. There are a lot of bills that we've passed that have wide bipartisan support. That was true in the last Congress. It was something like 85% of the bills that we actually passed in the House had like a 2/3 majority. And it's true this Congress as well, although I don't have the exact statistic in front of me. But I do think that it's really important that we find areas of common ground. And I think there's no place where it's more obvious than on energy, because, you know, we are dealing with real challenges. And, you know, what I always tell people is that I represent the energy capital of the world, and we care about the environment too. And we shouldn't be pitting them against each other. We should be bringing everybody together to try to solve these problems. And, you know, what I see generally when it comes to energy in Washington is that a lot of people are interested in energy issues. And as you said, they're really complex. And for some people, they're trying to understand them for the first time. You know, our future, kind of energy future, is very much on the minds of lawmakers in Washington. So it is really important to engage right now. But it's also true that a lot of people just don't have an understanding of our existing energy ecosystem, right? Our existing infrastructure, our existing fuel sources, you know, how and where we find them, how we extract them, how we move them, what we do with them, what we make with them, both, you know, here at home and around the world. So, you know, I think the next step is talking about how that may change, both, you know, supply and demand, which by all accounts is increasing, you know, as well as the sources and potential sources, new technologies, what the energy mix may look like over time, and how we move forward with reliable and abundant and affordable energy, and at the same time, talk about climate change and how we respond to that. You know, Americans are concerned about climate change, and I see it across the Congress amongst my colleagues. And so I think it's really important that we do both. And there's no doubt that conversation is shaping the conversation in Congress about what our energy future looks like, energy transition. But there's still a lot of work to do in forming a consensus position and a path forward. And that's where I think folks in the industry have a great role to play and a great opportunity. And like I said, just to depoliticize the conversation, build a real consensus and a path forward that achieves our energy and our climate goals.
Lizzie, one of the things I've noticed actually quite recently Secretary Granholm was recently in Houston. I think you were with her when she was here. And one of the topics she spoke to was carbon capture and storage. And I think it surprised some people in the industry to hear her say unequivocally that the administration was supportive of CCUS projects. They viewed them as central to a path to net zero over time. So might that be one example of an area where there will be really good bipartisan cooperation on an issue that's big and important and also important to Houston? And if so, are there any other areas kind of like CCUS which you see as good natural places for, quick, aggressive, bipartisan sort of efforts?
Yeah, thanks, Bobby. That's a great example. That may be the best example of where you see a lot of bipartisan consensus in Congress. And there's a lot of enthusiasm for CCUS. And of course, there's so much work happening in that space here in Houston. And so I think it's a great opportunity to do exactly what I know you've been talking about at the partnership in developing kind of the strategy, the transition initiative, because I think that there you really have the right message both locally and nationally about kind of those opportunities. And CCUS is something that I think has really captured the imagination of people on both sides of the aisle. There's also a lot of enthusiasm for what that technology could mean for direct air capture and other kinds of things. So I think that that's a great example. Another thing that the secretary was very excited about when she was here, that a lot of people in Washington are talking about, is hydrogen. And so that was a focus of her visit. And you're right, I got to spend the day with her. And we actually started the day with a tour of a hydrogen plant. And we're talking about kind of the possibilities there. And so I think that what I tend to see are those kinds of areas of opportunity come from having a real nuts and bolts conversation about what we're already doing and how that can be used to meet our goals in the future. And so those are two, I think, really great examples. And, that's kind of the message that I take to Washington, the message that I shared with the secretary. It's kind of, what I told her at the end of the day was that, in Houston, which is, of course, the place I represent, and as I look at this transition, one of my objectives is to make sure that Houston remains the energy capital of the world. And I think what we have here is really this expertise and experience combined with a culture of innovation, right? I mean, we put a man on the moon, right? We built the Astrodome, right? We can do anything. Plus this kind of drive and desire to be that partner, to be the leader really that our country needs and that the world needs right now when it comes to our energy future.
So Lizzie, I think you've just given us your at least a second, if not third or fourth idea, which is the Astrodome would make a great place to store CO2. I mean, just think of all that we could pack in there.
I am a fan of saving the Astrodome. That is my official position. I voted to preserve the Astrodome, and I am a fan. I think it is a monument to the ingenuity of this community, and we got to keep the Astrodome, and we've got to repurpose it and figure out something we can do into the next century.
Well, see, I'd say love you blue right now, but somebody would say that was a political comment, but it's not. It's just all about the Oilers. Maybe one question, Lizzie, I think, because Colin's going to jump in with two. The infrastructure bill. I guess, it's kind of interesting. The previous Congress or two, tried it. It's been talked about. Dan Sullivan, who's visited with us, he had an infrastructure bill. I think at some level, we all understand that infrastructure spending is necessary and good. But at another level, we're all going, golly, we are spending a lot of money lately. And I know interest rates are low, but is this really the time to spend some more? What would you say, particularly from a Houston and energy perspective, about the infrastructure bill?
Well, there are a couple of things that I would say, but maybe I'll take your question kind of in reverse order about the spending and then about the infrastructure bill, because I do think that it's a fair question and people are asking that question. And the way I always describe these decisions about kind of what we're doing, whether it's small or large, is through the prism that I really think defines my district, which is that we want government to be efficient, effective, and ethical. And that means being good stewards of our resources, including our tax dollars, including the choices we make about what we're spending and what we're spending it on. So we need our spending to reflect our values and priorities. And, in general, we need to be careful with deficit spending, obviously. But I think the questions really depend on what the spending is on. And when it comes to infrastructure in particular, I think it's important to remember that, while there's a cost to spending, there's also a cost to doing nothing. And in fact, that was the theme of the very first hearing I participated in Congress when I served on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. And a lot of these projects, a lot of the things that we're talking about now in this infrastructure package are projects that we've needed to invest in for a long time. And I think if we think of our spending from the government as investments, that's the frame we should use. And so what are we going to do in this infrastructure package? And what does it have the potential to do? And certainly what you've heard from the president and what you see from a lot of members of Congress is a real belief that by making these investments, we can help our country recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. We can help get people back to work while addressing critical needs in infrastructure and also building back a better and more resilient infrastructure that will help our economy into the 21st century. So I think that's really important to think about it as an important part of our recovery from COVID, but also thinking ahead. Harris County, my district is entirely contained in Harris County, and it is not only already the third largest county in the country, but it's the third fastest growing. So there are a lot of opportunities to ensure that our region is prepared for future growth in this infrastructure bill. It's also really important the kinds of investments we're making across the country. So, in sort of broad strokes, the bill is going to improve our roads and bridges. Right now, I think 1 in 5 miles of highways and roads and 45,000 bridges are in poor condition. Our infrastructure is getting failing grades, or maybe barely passing grades. And so we really need to invest and make sure that our roads and bridges are safe, that we can move commerce, we can move products, whether, on the highways, whether we're doing it with trucks of any kind, all the kinds of things that we need to do to make sure that we can move goods across the country is really important. So that's a big piece of the framework. Investing in public transit, another really important piece. Even before COVID, there was a lot of deferred maintenance. And there's also an effort to really modernize and improve accessibility for people. So investing in public transit is another important thing that will help keep our people moving and our economy moving. Another thing that's been so clear during the pandemic that's a huge priority of the Congress and work we're doing on my committee on energy and commerce is expanding broadband access. There has been a conversation for several years, ever since I've been in the Congress, about expanding rural broadband and how important it is for people across the country to have access to broadband. But what we've seen in the pandemic is there are parts of urban areas, including parts of my own district, where people don't have reliable internet access. And we've seen how important it is. We're meeting over Zoom right now. We know that people are using Zoom for business. Students are learning remotely. And there's a lot of that may continue into the future that we want to be able to rely on, but we need reliable broadband. And so that's a really key piece. And then another thing that resonates here at home, as well as across the country, is we've got to ensure clean drinking water in every home. And that's a huge priority of this bill, investing $55 billion in clean drinking water. So, these are and should be priority investments for all Americans. And they're the things that we really do need to do to ensure that our country is ready to compete in this 21st century economy, and really to make sure that we can recover from the pandemic. So, your question about spending certainly ties into what are you spending it for, and what are you going to get out of your investment? And certainly that's something that y'all specialize in, analyzing, what you can get from your investments here. But I think these are important investments for us to make. And economists are telling us this is the time to make them. And in fact, they encouraged us last year when we were starting to do a lot of the COVID relief packages to go even bigger than we did, that the economy needed it. And I think what we've seen now is that those were smart investments and they were needed at the time. And I think that there's a general sentiment in Congress right now that this infrastructure bill provides that same kind of opportunity and a real opportunity to restart and shape our path forward, not just when it comes to energy, but thinking about how we're going to live in the 21st century and investing in things that will make us all successful.
So, Lizzie, you were pretty specific about a lot of those investments. It seems that the media likes to focus on the headline price tag, 2 trillion, 4 trillion, 6 trillion. And yet, I think we can all agree that there's a pretty big number that everybody would agree we should do, drawing from the list you just gave. If you had to pick a couple of specific projects that most get you excited and to take you off the hook, it doesn't have to be in Houston, it could be anywhere in the country, and you're not, rank ordering them precisely, but just can you give us a little flavor for, maybe some specific cities or locations where, growth in people is just happening so fast. We've really got to make it a priority as a country.
There are a lot of things in this bill. There are a lot of really exciting things in the bill. And of course, there's some very specific things in a part of the bill that we've already passed out of the House. We already passed the surface transportation portion out of the House, and there are some specific programs that I had for our community here in Houston, including increasing a bike lane or bike transportation from Memorial Park to Uptown and improving the 82 Westheimer bus route, which runs the length of my district. So those are very important to me. But more broadly, I do think that a lot of this investment really does reflect important things as we think about how we're going to live going forward. And that one of the areas where I've been particularly focused in advocating is making sure we have money for resiliency and having resilient infrastructure, especially along the coast. That is a priority. And so if I had to pick one thing that I would love for everyone to pay attention to, it's really making sure that as we talk about kind of bold and transformative infrastructure investments, that we do things that are really transformational. And I think protecting the coastline, investing in the kind of infrastructure, using natural infrastructure, making our areas, coastal areas more resilient is important. I testified before the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee on the importance of doing this and having funding for projects like the Texas Coastal Spine, known to us here affectionately in Houston as the Ike Dike. And that is a huge piece, really, when you think about our energy infrastructure as well, protecting all the assets and the people along the Houston Ship Channel, making sure that we can prevent an economic and environmental disaster unlike any I think our country has seen. Those kinds of investments are really, really important. And so I've had a particular focus on coastal resiliency and kind of building a coalition around that and making sure that we can think about, when we think about infrastructure, think about not just the traditional roads and bridges, but thinking about coastal resiliency, certainly here in Houston, thinking about flooding and water conveyance infrastructure as a really important part of making sure our communities are able to thrive.
Lizzie, back to the issue of just climate change and an energy transition. One of the real challenges here, and something that gets a lot of attention from our U.S. incumbent oil and gas companies, is that the problem is truly a global problem, and simply shifting production outside of the United States to other places without impacting demand actually does nothing to take CO2 out of the air. Arguably, it just changes changes the producers to the detriment of U.S. companies. So that's a perspective of, I think, the U.S. incumbent oil and gas business. How is that issue thought about and talked about in the Congress, and particularly on your side of the aisle on the issue that's so fundamentally global in nature?
Yeah, well, that's an excellent point, Bobby. And I think it's one that I try to bring to the conversations that I'm participating in the Congress, because we know here in Houston that this is a global business. Of course, the U.S. Congress is typically focused on a lot of domestic policy. And so you really have to marry those concepts. I think it's important for us to show global leadership. And I think you hear that throughout the House Democratic Caucus. There's been a lot of focus on making sure that we are the leaders on climate issues. And at the same time, we want to be the leaders in energy for the globe. And I think people understand that there are various factors here that are important. There are all kinds of different things that matter to different members, but having a full picture view of the global nature of the climate issues and the global nature of energy demand and need, and the importance of energy and lifting people out of poverty. Those are real and important issues that we do talk about. And, I think that for companies here, they recognize, perhaps because they are the closest to it, that oil and gas are going to be part of our energy mix well into the future, that there's demand around the globe for those products and potentially for other products that we're using less of here, right? We're using less coal. We've replaced, at least in the power sector, we've replaced a lot of those coal-fired power plants with natural gas plants. We have the opportunity to do that by exporting LNG around the world. But what we see is construction of coal-fired power plants in India and in China, and we have an opportunity to get in there and help reduce greenhouse gas emissions by exporting LNG. So that's a really important issue that folks in Congress need to be focused on, and where folks in the industry, I think, can help educate about what they're seeing in terms of demand, what other fuel sources are used around the world, and frankly, who's supplying them if it's not us. And I think that's a really important issue to drive home, or a point to drive home, is that, industry can and should play a meaningful role in these conversations. Companies here know how to produce energy that is cleaner, whether it's on our land or offshore. And I really see an opportunity to take a leading role in this conversation, because there are a lot of values that we see reflected in our companies that we want to see reflected around the world, right? So, we have better environmental standards for our production. We have better worker safety standards for our production. These are things that Americans value and believe in. These are things that House Democrats value and believe in. And so, bringing to the conversation a perspective on demand and also supply, and how we can do that, and how we want the United States to be energy independent, and we want to lead in energy production of whatever kind of energy it is. And that's kind of my message for Houston, as well as for the United States, that whatever energy people around the world want, we can lead in terms of supplying it. We can lead in terms of driving to whether it's new technologies that we can export, new fuel sources. We can drive the demand, but we want to be the leaders in all of it. And I think that that's an absolutely vital message that's in the United States' interest, certainly in the interest of the folks who live and work in my district. And I think it's important to share that message in Congress, and to make sure that people are engaged. Again, kind of taking the politics out and bringing a real view of what is a workable, achievable plan that responds to all of the incredibly complex issues that we see when it comes to the energy transition. I think it's really, really important, Bobby, that you asked that question, and that we continue to think of this as a global challenge and also a global opportunity.
So, Lizzie, we were kicking off early on talking about, I did think that was a great exchange. And you guys talking about natural gas in particular is really interesting. Colin and I did have breakfast in Boston this morning. And up here, people are still using heating oil because natural gas is more expensive. And the only reason it's more expensive is policy reasons and infrastructure reasons, not because it's actually more expensive. So these things are fascinating the way they play out sometimes. I guess the question on depoliticizing energy, why do you think, what can we in the energy community do? Because sometimes it feels like there's a lot of people who don't understand things. There's a lot of people who feel really strongly one way or the other. There just seem to be an installed base of people that just really don't like oil and gas, right? Like, even if oil and gas was cleaner, they would say, yeah, we still don't like it. There's just this community. Is there anything we can do in the industry to reach people, to better communicate, to, I almost think this is an extreme comment, Lizzie, but it seems like oil and gas is viewed as a funding source for the Republican Party. And most Democrats just look at it like, oh God, those guys, they're supporting everything we're against. What can we as an industry do to improve our popularity ratings, if for lack of a better way to say it?
Well, I think that, there are a few things that industry and folks, who work in the industry can and should do. And it all starts with engaging on these topics and doing so in a way that comes from a place of shared values, right? Talking about why both what we've been able to accomplish, right? What affordable, abundant energy has meant for the United States and for people around the world, and acknowledging that there are real challenges in front of us, and talking about shared values when it comes to environmental issues, climate included, but not exclusively. There's a lot of discussion right now in Congress about environmental justice. There's a lot of conversations about, how we deal with history and emissions and kind of where we go from here. And it's not limited to the climate. And so I think the most important thing to do is show a willing and genuine partnership. And in my experience, that is true. That's true of the people that I represent. That's true of the folks who live and work in my district. Like I said, we're the energy capital of the world, and we believe in climate change, and we care about the environment too. And so I think that those are really, it's the place to start, and finding that common ground, talking about everything we do. I often tell my colleagues how most of my meetings in person in Houston always start with a safety moment, because safety is so important, and that's so ingrained in the culture. And that's something that, maybe people in Boston wouldn't expect to start their meetings with a discussion about where the exits are. But that is definitely part of the culture. So worker safety, that's a shared value. Environmental protection. I worked for a lot of folks who were in the industry in my time as a lawyer. And I worked on all kinds of matters, upstream, midstream, downstream, lots of different issues. And I think you're right. There's a lot people don't know or understand. But I certainly witnessed firsthand the commitment of the people who go to work every day, determined to protect the environment, who were in these groups that were working on environmental safety. And I think it's really important to talk about those shared values. I think the other thing that we need to do is not just talk about the present, but talking into the future, and really showing that people who work in the industry right now are precisely the people we need, right? The scientists, the innovators, the risk takers, which is definitely a part of the culture. People who have big ideas, and frankly, companies that have big R&D budgets to help find solutions to the problems that are in front of us. I think that is what we do here in Houston, right? We work together. We come from different perspectives. We come from different backgrounds, but we all kind of come together around finding solutions. And I think that demonstrating that partnership from folks in the industry and really leaning in, which frankly, people are already doing. A lot of the people who live and work in my district are already way ahead than our political conversation here. So part of it is just bringing the political conversation up to speed. But part of it is explaining to people and truly engaging and bringing that conversation forward. And I think that you're right that not everyone knows. And certainly there are people all across the spectrum. But what our objective should be here is to build a consensus path forward, engaging in a very thoughtful process that recognizes the supply and the demand issues, the role that new technologies are going to play, the role that existing fuel sources are going to play into the future, right? And focusing on kind of an all of the above approach that is focused on reducing emissions, and making sure that we maintain kind of our role as a leader, both in energy and environment, for people here and around the globe.
Well, Lizzie, those were great suggestions. I mean, as I was listening to that, not only you've given us some really great things to think about today, but I think we all just owe you a huge thank you, right? Thank you for coming, but also the fact that you do have this unique role. You are obviously a Democrat, but a Houstonian, an energy person, environmentalist. The role you're playing is a particularly special one. And so we just want to say thank you. And it was really wonderful to have you.
I really just love representing Houston and the 7th Congressional District and the people who live and work here. And I just feel like it is both a real privilege and also a pleasure. And I'm so proud to get to do it. So I appreciate you thanking me, but that's what I'm here for. And I think that the kinds of things we're talking about now are the place where those of us who are in Houston and people in the industry can make a huge difference. Both, across our country and around the world. And now's the time to demonstrate that, what I call Houston values that I see just reflected here. That's just, inclusion and innovation and collaboration. All of those things are what we need now to move forward when it comes to energy and when it comes together with a lot of the other priorities that we talked about at the beginning. So it is an absolute privilege and pleasure to get to represent y'all and to get to work with you. And I look forward to getting together and visiting again in the very near future.
Well, anything you ever need. I mean, Matt was just hanging out with 700 carbon sequestration types today, but anything you ever need from our firm as you engage in all these discussions, we're here to help. And again, thank you. Thank you, Bobby. Bobby helped us connect with you. So thank you, Bobby. And thank you, Lizzie. Really appreciate it.